Welcome to the Strength for the Day podcast, which is a daily Bible study with Dennis Fountain. We hope this time together will be challenging, sharpening, uplifting, encouraging, and strengthening to your Christian walk. Thank you for joining us, and we pray you are helped through today's study.
Hey, good morning, and welcome to our last day this month in our study in the book of 1 Samuel. And I pray that through this study that you've learned something. I hope that you have been challenged, and I hope you've received strength each and every day as we've been studying out this passage. And really, this entire book is a great place. It actually continues into 2 Samuel. As a matter of fact, it wasn't until many, really hundreds of years down the road that 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel were divided. They used to be just one book, but we're divided. I forget exactly the story behind it right now. My brain's not working too well down that road, but you can look it up and learn about this. So I would encourage you, just keep reading into 2 Samuel. You will see, of course, a lot take place. And then finally, I think it's 2 Samuel chapter number 2. David gets anointed as king of Judah. And then I believe it's chapter number 5. Let's see. Yeah, chapter 5 through 7, where David finally takes the throne over all of Israel. But today, this morning, we are in 1 Samuel chapter number 31. I want you to remember with me all the way back to 1 Samuel, really chapter 10, 11, 12, 13, and there was a young man that was anointed king, and his name was Saul. He was a good young man. He was humble. He was somebody that wanted to follow God. He wanted God's plan in his life. You can go and do some research about the character traits of Saul at the beginning of his reigning, his kingship, and you would find that Saul was a great guy. But by the time we get to 1 Samuel 28 and 29 and 30, we find Saul as this self-absorbed, proud, jealous, envious dictator. He no longer was leading and influencing people well. Now he is trying to kill David, one of his right-hand men, and he's lying. And in 1 Samuel 28, he's trying to get very much away from God and conjure up these spirits and all of that stuff. And we find him sacrificing to the Lord out of disobedience. We find him ignoring Samuel before Samuel passed away. Really, it's like Saul is a different person. And as you come to 1 Samuel 31, we kind of come face to face with the thought of what could have been. What if Saul would have continued on the trajectory of loving God, walking humbly before God, desiring God's plan in his life? What could have been? I think 1 Samuel 31 really helps us out with that. And so it's not a long chapter, just 13 verses. So let's read those, and then we'll get some thoughts today. All right, 1 Samuel chapter number 31, beginning in verse number 1, it says this: Now the Philistines fought against Israel. Remember, this is the war that David even could have been in against his own people, and yet God protected him from this. So the Philistines fight against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain in Mount Gilboa. Then the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, Saul's sons. The battle became fierce against Saul, and the archers hit him. He was severely wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and thrust me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul, his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men died together that same day. When the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley and those who were on the other side of the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, notice what it says in verse 7. They forsook the cities and fled, and the Philistines came and dwelt in them. So it happened the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen in Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor and sent word throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim it in the temple of their idols and among the people. Then they put his armor in the temple of the Ashtaroths, and they fastened his body to the wall of Beth-shan. We'd say Beth-shan, but it's actually Beth-shean. Now when the inhabitants of Jabesh-Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and traveled all night, took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Beth-shan, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there. Then they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. This is an interesting passage. It takes us a few minutes to kind of read through it, but the long story short, Saul and his armor bearer and his 3 sons are killed in battle against the Philistines. And instead of the people of Israel rallying behind the death of their king, we find in verse 7 that they're just like, forget it. And they go home and they grab their families and they leave their towns. And the Philistines come in and they conquer the territory. Now, this is something that, of course, God had given this territory to the people of Israel. But now we find them abandoning it because the king is dead. They kind of throw up their hands, who cares, and they just move on. But there's not everybody does that. We read that the men of Jabesh-Gilead, remember all the way back in the beginning of Saul's reign, when he came to the defense of Jabesh-Gilead, when he was humble, when he was pursuing God, in that passage, he sought the Lord, he defended the name of God, he defended the people of God. He really was a man that loved the Lord in that passage. Now we see those men, those people from Jabesh-Gilead, they hear that Saul's been slain and that his head and body have been completely decimated by the Philistines and hung now in Beth-shan. And so what do? They pack up and they travel up there and they sneak in. They get, of course, Saul and Jonathan's heads and bodies, and they give them a proper burial, and they honor him and his sons as the king and their princes. But how did Saul end up in this place? When you look at this, I see, number one, I see that Saul ignored the plan of God in his life. God wanted him to be king and lead the people, but Saul instead was selfish and just pursued his own desires. I see, number two, that Saul failed the people of God that God desired for him to be an influence in. The very people of God that Saul was supposed to lead, he didn't lead them. He followed his own pursuits, but then he didn't influence them toward the Lord. Now they're at the place, they're at war, and they don't even want to stand for God in this. Verse number 7 is a key verse in this passage, that they see that the king's dead. It's like, meh, oh well, they were just fighting for him, not fighting for the Lord, not realizing the inheritance that God had given them, not proclaiming or desiring to proclaim that we are in this for God. But then I see also that Saul, he destroyed God's name. I mean, in this, there is really no mention of God. The people are not pursuing God. The people are not coming after God. What are they doing? Well, they are just at the place where they're saying, you know what, forget it. So Saul, he really lost opportunity to influence these people toward God. He himself destroyed God's name, even in him committing suicide and all of that. Man, there's so much there about him destroying the testimony of God before the Philistines and before the people that he was supposed to influence. But at the end of this story, I see a glimpse of God's grace and what could have been. When Jabesh-Gilead honored Saul, did you know that could have been all of Israel honoring Saul? It could have been if Saul would have stayed humble, walked with God, I think we could have read a very different ending to the story. But we don't. We read about a selfish man dying a lonely death and not being honored, not receiving the tribute. We see him not glorifying God. We see him as a self-righteous man dying alone. Man, what could have been if Saul would have just walked with God? What could have been if he would have stayed humble? What could have been if Saul would have just put his relationship, like we learned yesterday, his relationship with the Lord first. But instead, he allowed pride, selfishness, his own arrogance, he allowed that to lead his decisions. You know, I heard it said years ago that I'd rather get to the end of my life and be able to say I'm glad I did rather than what could have been or I wished I would. I'm glad I did rather than I wished I would. You know, I hope that I get to the end of my life and look back and say, I'm glad I did pursue God, keep him first, love my family, lead our church well, rather than I wish I would have. Saul's at the end of his life, I'm sure, saying there, and here in 1 Samuel 31, I wish I would have kept God first. I wish I would have done this or that. You know, I want to encourage you today, make the decision that you're not going to have this mindset of looking back on your life saying, I wish I would have. You're going to be able to say, I'm glad I did. But the I'm glad I did at the end of life comes through the day in and day out decisions of pursuing God. Just keeping him first, keeping a humble heart with God and desiring to walk with him each and every day. You know, in your life and in my life, my dad used to say it this way, if there's still breath in your lungs, then you can know that God is still working in you. And so wherever you're at in life, maybe you would look at your story and you'd say, man, my story is a lot like Saul. I was humble at one time, but now I've been filled with arrogance, wandering, getting away from the Lord. Can I tell you, if you're still breathing, there's still hope. You can just come back to the Lord. What do I have to do? That's the great thing about God. It's not about what we do. It's just about me connecting in that relationship with him. Simply, Lord, I'm sorry. I'm asking you to forgive me for getting away from you. And God, I just want a restored relationship with you again. And may each of us desire to make decisions every day to help us get to the end of our life and be able to say, I'm glad I did, rather than I wish I would have. Hope that'll be a help to you and encouragement. Let's go into this weekend. Have a great weekend. Got a lot of graduations coming up for some folks in our church. And of course, my son graduates in a week. Can't believe that. And so encourage you wherever you go to church this weekend, whatever graduations you're going to, just be an encouragement to those around you. Look forward to starting a brand new study on Monday and the month of June, and we'll have a great time. We'll see you then.